welcome to the Good Stories podcast. I'm Jody here again with Stephen, and let's start today with our top 5 new download locations this week. So, thank you out there from Grantham, UK, Genoa, New York, Cambridge, UK, Madison, Wisconsin, and Muskegon, Michigan. Thank you all for listening. It's funny, 2 people from the UK, or 2 locations from the UK this week. I have noticed something that several times now, we will get some new listeners from the UK and a nice compliment, a review, words, and a 4-star rating. So I'm not complaining. 4 out of 5 is fine. But to anyone out there in the UK listening, I'm just curious, do you guys give 5 stars? Or is it like 4's the top, the best you can do? I don't know. Maybe it's just us.
Maybe it's just us.
It reminded me of the show Arrested Development when his kid gets an A- on a test.
I'm proud of you. Minus.
Very proud. Anyway, I actually don't mind. I just thought it was funny. But you can reach us on Facebook or by email if you want to let us know. goodstoriespodcast@gmail.com. If you haven't yet given us a review or a rating, please do. They help us grow, and it's just cool to get the feedback. So, all right, to today's story. This week, we're going back to Plutarch. And the last time we talked about Plutarch was, episode 11. So it's been a while when we talked about the Greek roller coaster that was Alcibiades. In case you're not aware, Plutarch was a biographer back during the time of Rome, and he died in the year 120 AD. But he was well-educated and a researcher who studied people who did awesome things, great lives. And he actually tells us himself that he wrote biographies, not so much as a historian, but as a storyteller, trying to show who those people really were, their real character and behaviors. So today we chose someone you've no doubt heard of, even though he lived so long ago. A man who conquered an amazingly big portion of the world, Alexander the Great. So with that, time for his story.
The king of Macedon and the ruler of Greece has been murdered. Upon his death, his young son Alexander takes power. The young king, eager for glory, takes the army prepared by his father on an audacious campaign of conquest across Greece, Persia, the known world, and beyond. Undefeated in battle, he is known to us by the title Alexander the Great.
Very good. So, Stevie, I'm going to let you mostly drive today because I feel like you've been training your whole life for this moment.
A little bit. I mean, Alexander is one of those characters I've just thought about kind of my whole life once I learned who he was. And I don't think I'm alone in that. When it comes to secular characters out of history, I don't think anyone is better known than Alexander the Great. That there are more people just passionate about him than anyone else I can think of.
So how did you learn of him? So Plutarch does this parallel life. So he actually pairs Alexander the Great with Julius Caesar, who we're not talking about today because there's just so much about Alexander to cover off on.
And so much about Julius Caesar
to
talk about. He deserves his own.
Fair enough. But if you don't read Plutarch, if you don't pick that up, how do you learn about Alexander?
That is a great question, and I can't remember a time that I didn't know about Alexander the Great. It probably came from Dad, like most things in my childhood. He probably mentioned him or talked about him at some point, and then I got interested and I started reading and looking into it. I can vaguely remember a couple of sort of children's books about Alexander of Macedon. But yeah, I can't remember a time when I wasn't aware of him as a character.
Well, before Plutarch, I knew the name of Alexander and a little bit about him, but I know so much more now. Like, it really covers his life. And if you'd asked me even a year ago, Plutarch was not something that I would have picked up. So thank you to you for that. But he does tell stories about lives. It's not just this dry historical record. There's actual things that happen in his life. He makes people human. He writes them as though they were human, as he was. Alexander was a human. Incredible doing it. So where do you want to start?
Well, first of all, it just tickles my heart a little bit that you're enjoying Plutarch. Listeners, Jody has humored me on this. I mean, the fact that she was willing to do Alcibiades, I had my doubts that I would ever get her to do another Plutarch, but Alexander the Great is so much fun, and Plutarch is so much fun. He is, bar none, my favorite 1st and 2nd century Middle Platonist philosopher and biographer. He is wonderful, and so much of what we know about the lives of great men from the past really does funnel its way through Plutarch. I guess it's probably worth putting Alexander the Great, though, in sort of the sweep of history. Where is he in history? So Plutarch is writing at the end of the 1st, early 2nd century AD, and so clearly Alexander is before that. Alexander's dates are 356 BC to 323 BC. There's debate, but pretty close. Those are his range. Remember, when you're talking dates BC, they go in the reverse order. So the bigger number is actually farther back in time, and the smaller number is actually further forward in time. This is a time where Rome as a city existed, but not an empire. This is before the Second Punic War, where Rome fought with Hannibal. This is after a lot of the Greek wars. This is after the Battle of Marathon, after the Battle of Thermopylae, after what's called the Peloponnesian War, where Athens and Sparta fought each other. This is after Socrates, after Plato. So after so many of these famous and renowned characters in Greek history, that Alexander the Great steps on the scene, and he steps on the scene kind of as the end of the Greek world, but also in some ways the pinnacle of it, as he spreads the Greek world through the known world. And so Plutarch, thank you for writing about him. Jody, thank you for reading Plutarch.
So the only things I knew about Alexander really before were from a kind of horrible movie that I don't even remember what it's called. And he's depicted as kind of a mess in all the ways. He wasn't a mess. This kid was put together. But those dates you said, whether you're counting negative or positive, they aren't very far apart.
No.
This guy did all that he did. Keep in mind as we talk through this, he dies at the young age of 32. 32!
Unbelievable.
Shocking. I knew he died fairly young, rather young, to do as much as he did.
And every great public character afterwards, every general, every statesman, every king, every ruler has compared themselves to Alexander and found themselves wanting in terms of accomplishment. And he really did set a standard that I don't know if anybody's ever going to top.
By age 32?
By age 32.
Phenomenal. So reading through this, brother, I was amazed how many names are familiar. So Aristotle, Pythagoras, Ptolemy. I mean, there's so many names in this, and I want you to tell me when they're really the guy.
Oh, yes.
And when there's somebody else, because that's the other confusing thing. My church is going through the book of Daniel right now from the Old Testament, and King Darius and King Cyrus are in it. I don't think they're the same as the King Darius and Cyrus referenced in this. I looked it up, and it said they were a couple hundred years different.
Correct. It depends which reference you're referring to. And so we'll get to that in here, but yeah, it's not the same Darius. The Cyrus from the Bible does get mentioned in this work. We actually see his tomb. But the Cyrus that gets the more recent one that's more close to the life of Alexander is a different Cyrus.
Yeah. Tell me when they're the same and when they're different, because that's part of my difficulty with Greek names is that they recycled a lot of names. There's more than one of the same guy named the same thing. Mm-hmm. And so keeping that clear is tricky for me, but I know you'll help me. So here we go.
Yeah, I think a good way to start, is it okay if I just read the first paragraph here? Because I think this sets up a lot about Plutarch and a lot about Alexander. It being my purpose to write the lives of Alexander the king and of Caesar, by whom Pompey was destroyed, the multitude of their great actions affords so large a field that I were to blame if I should not, by the way of apology, forewarn my reader that I have chosen rather to epitomize the most celebrated parts of their story than to insist at large on every particular circumstance of it. It must be borne in mind that my design is not to write histories, but lives. And the most glorious exploits do not always furnish us with the clearest discoveries of virtue or vice in men. Sometimes a matter of less moment, an expression or a jest, informs us better of their characters and inclinations than the most famous sieges, the greatest armaments, or the bloodiest battles whatsoever. Therefore, as a portrait painters are more exact in the lines and features of the face in which the character is seen than in the other parts of the body, so I must be allowed to give my more particular attention to the marks and indications of the souls of men. And while I endeavor by these to portray their lives, may be free to leave more weighty matters and great battles to be treated of by others. And so that really gives you an insight of what Plutarch is trying to do here. He's not writing history. He's not trying to outline the life of Alexander step by step, although honestly he does a pretty good job of that. What he's trying to do is express something about the soul of Alexander, who he was as a person, and I think that's important. Now, one of the things we might be wondering is, well, okay, how true is this then? We just said that Alexander was in the 4th century BC, and here we have this guy writing in the 1st and 2nd century AD. That's many hundreds of years later. Do we have any better? Do we have any closer? Do we have any primary sources? Bluntly, no, we don't. This is about as close as you can get. Plutarch, a guy named Arrian, a guy named Curtius Rufus, and a guy named Diodorus Siculus all wrote about the same time period, and these are really what come to us as the earliest sources on Alexander. Arius and Plutarch tend to follow each other fairly closely. There's more disagreement behind the other sources. Arius is very clear that he got much of his record from some of the primary sources, and Plutarch references all sorts of primary sources and all sorts of letters that he had access to. But again, those primary things are lost to us. But what we do have saved is here, and it's great.
I thought it was interesting that Plutarch references Alexander's diaries and letters that he'd sent all the time. Very thoughtful, caring letters, but we'll get to that.
Some of them are, some of them less so.
Well, fair enough. Mixed bag. But I do have a different book than you, as I feel like always we do. But mine starts, the story goes that Philip and Olympias first met during their initiation into the sacred mysteries of Samothrace. There's a lot of words in this that I don't know what they mean. And names, tons of names, because he was a general and a king. And so a lot of characters, but the important ones, as usual, come back around. So Philip was the king and Alexander's father. Olympias was his mom.
And to understand Alexander, you have to start with his parents, because Philip II of Macedon, his father, is really in many ways the starting point for what his son was able to do. When Philip took the throne of Macedon, there was debate about whether Macedon was even Greek. There was this whole Greek world, but on the outskirts to the north were these barbarians, these Macedonians. And there was nobody who thought they were going to be taking over the world in a couple years. Enter Philip. Philip was a genius of his own right. He was a master statesman. He was a master general. And over the course of his life, which he lived hard, he unified Greece by the sword. He took over and conquered such famous people as the Thebans. I mean, he just owned the whole thing, and he was the one who really formed and set up the army so that it could go do this incredible thing, Philip and his generals. And so important in the life of Alexander. Olympias, his mother, equally important in the life of Alexander. He, in many ways, is kind of the original mama's boy. He loved his mother, and his mother loved him. And in the high-stakes, cutthroat world of Macedonian and Greek politics, she came to play. She was definitely the religious one, but the religious rites that she held to, even Philip thought were kind of weird. I mean, this was strange, but she brought with her an incredible bloodline. And Alexander grew up believing that he was descended through his mother from Hercules and from the great warrior Achilles of the Iliad.
I read in another book, just in looking into this, they described it really well, how at this time there was kind of a Eastern and Western division. And so the east would have been from where Alexander sat when he was born. The east would have been across the Hellespont, across the Aegean Sea, across the Mediterranean Sea, across all this big water, the Persian Empire, the Medians, but these huge empires to the east. And then in large part, there's this block of water or these links of water. And then on the west are the Greeks. And as you said, Rome wasn't Rome yet, not as we think of it. Who else was on the west?
Carthage was coming up. So Phoenicia and Carthage.
He goes up the Danube. Well, that's further north, right?
Yeah.
That would have been like the barbaric tribes further north, right?
Were considered the barbaric tribes. But Macedon wasn't too far from that. And they were considered the barbaric tribes by many of the Greeks at the time. And so let's jump into it because this is packed. And what he is going to do is just bounce from one place to the other and all sorts of different things. We've talked a little bit about Olympias. We've talked a little bit about Philip. There were all these oracles about him before his birth, all these weird things that get documented. It says Olympias dreamed that a thunderbolt struck her body when he was conceived. Philip dreams of basically putting a seal on his wife's body with a lion because something great was going to come out. And then, of course, there's the classic story that Philip looked in and saw Olympias lying with this great snake, this mighty serpent. And that was even too much for Philip. That was bizarre. But his birth was kind of presaged by all these kind of marvels, as we often see in these old stories. And then on the day of Alexander's birth, 3 great things were said to happen. It was said that Philip got word from his general Parmenio that the Illyrians had been overthrown, one of those savage tribes in the north. It says he got word that his horse had won the Olympic Games. Now, Philip had to kind of bully himself into the Olympics because, again, they didn't even think he was Greek. But he got them to acknowledge his Greekness so he could compete, and his horse won. And it was said on that day that Alexander was born.
And so this is a time with soothsayers and reading of portents and omens and the oracle at Delphi. I mean, these things are active and present in these people's lives. So this 3 wonderful things on the same day for Philip is this wonderful sign. And mine says that his son born on a day coinciding with these 3 great triumphs would surely prove invincible. Which is an interesting thing. Sometimes in history, kings don't like it when they have a very strong son. But he, at this time, is very happy.
And I have to say, Philip is an amazing character in his own right. If Alexander was never born or died young or never existed, I think we would be talking about Philip the Great. What he did was on that level and was amazing in his own right. But not least of what he did is exactly that. He raised his son to command. He raised his son to be the king. Now, they didn't always get along, and we'll talk about some of those stories here, but I think Philip deserves a ton of credit for what he tried to do with Alexander and what ended up happening with Alexander's career. The childhood of Alexander didn't last very long. I guess it lasted as long as any other childhood, but from a young age, he was involved in the court. He was involved with war, and all sorts of stories from his childhood come out. There's a story where the Persian ambassadors come to visit the court at Pella, which is the capital of Macedon, and Alexander interviews them, and they're amazed by his wisdom as he's asking them things about their military, about their roads, about their logistics, and the kind of a thought that he was just planning for a few years later when he was going to take him out. But they were amazed by him. But I think one of my favorite stories of his childhood is the story of his horse, Bucephalus.
Very good.
Have you heard of that before, or was this one new to you?
It was new in this reading, but go for it.
So Bucephalus was a great horse that Philip was going to buy, but he was going to be charged a ridiculous amount of money. You can't really trust all the numbers in this book, whether it's troop numbers or deaths or money, but we'll throw some of them out because it helps to give a sense. Apparently, this horse was going to cost Philip 13 talents. Now, exactly what a talent is varies through history, but I heard one professor describe it as a useful way to think of it is it's about enough to build a warship. So that's a significant amount of money. Yeah, I mean, you and I have talked in the past about thinking about dollars in terms of tacos.
Yes.
You know, something costs $30, 30 tacos, okay?
It makes it more tangible for me. I mean, it's a cheap taco, but...
Yeah. This is royalty, so they don't talk tacos. They talk
Warships.
warships. And 13 warships for this one horse is the idea. And so the problem was nobody could tame it. It was so strong and so fierce and so wild that nothing could tame it. And Alexander was said to be watching on, and he lamented that they were ruining this horse, that they weren't able to handle it. And Philip got annoyed and said, "You're a kid. You think you're so smart? You think you can handle this when all these others can't do it?" And he said, "Yeah, I can." And Philip said, "Well, what'll you lose if you fail?" And he says, "I'll pay for it. I will pay the entire price of the horse." And according to the story, Alexander had noticed that Bucephalus, this mighty horse, was afraid of its own shadow. So he turned it towards the sun, was kind to it, stroked it, ended up jumping on him and broke the horse immediately. And this horse became with him for the rest of his life. And then after all this, his father had something to say.
"My son, seek a kingdom worthy of yourself, for Macedonia will not contain you."
Well, you took those words to heart. And again, though, his father kept him absolutely involved, and he was leading cavalry units by age 16. He was commanding when his father was off doing another thing. There's a story that I think when he was 16, his father was out doing something, and so he had command of the country for a little bit. He overthrew a neighboring country and established a colony, which he named after himself. This was what he did as a teenage prank, right? Parents leave. He didn't throw a party in the palace. He went and conquered a nation. And this is just Alexander, is what he is. And then, of course, one of the great battles of history is something called the Battle of Chaeronea. The Battle of Chaeronea is really where Philip established his final dominance over the Greek world, because this was the overthrow of, it was a whole assembly. A lot of people have heard of somebody named Demosthenes. Demosthenes was a great Greek orator who hated Philip. He saw Philip as a tyrant, as an invader, and somebody that must be opposed on all counts. Well, Demosthenes was able to develop this alliance against Philip that just got crushed at the Battle of Chaeronea. And so at the Battle of Chaeronea, this is where the famed sacred band of the Thebans was utterly destroyed. And it was destroyed by Alexander. This was before he was the Great, who was leading the cavalry of his father as a teenager against one of the mightiest fighting forces of the ancient world and routed them to a man. Just incredible.
If we're bridging stories, Demosthenes showed up on my who's who in this book because of Ender's Game. We did Ender's Game, again, long ago, but Demosthenes is one of the philosopher names that one of the kids takes inside of Ender's Game. And the description of Philippics and the argument in philosophy. So just story bridging there, one thing, but a little bit more about young Alexander, because I was just so surprised. They do describe how he looked. He was quite striking, and he's preserved for all time in these statues and things and artwork, but he had a head tilt. Mm-hmm. And they describe the rich fragrance of his body. I mean, it's a little weird.
They go into like medical logic, like ancient medical logic about heat and his smell.
It's the heat of his hot and fiery nature.
That's right.
Causing the sweet smell of his body. That cracked me up. I was also surprised because Philip, I mean, as you said, he was stoked that his horse won at the Olympic Games. Alexander didn't really seem to care about those. And it says he didn't even like grappling or fighting. And at one point, his friends ask him, like, hey, come race with us, or will you race? And he says, yes, if I have kings to compete against. Like, this kid was not messing around. He had his eye on conquering from basically the beginning.
And between his father and his mother, I don't know how he couldn't. I mean, that's what his father did, was spend his life actually doing that. And his mother wanted big things for him. She never let him forget that he was a descendant of Achilles and Hercules and that he was expected to do great things. And they found really important teachers for him. So there's 3 that get listed. Leonidas, which is a name you've probably heard, but different one. Leonidas was the king at Thermopylae. That's not this one. Leonidas, however it's pronounced. I
Well,
don't
but
know.
that's what you mean, that you've probably heard the
Yes.
name, but that was a different one?
Yes.
Yeah, I've heard it Leonidas, but that's not this one. This is a teacher.
This is a teacher, but he was strict. I mean, he really put Alexander through his paces as a young man. And so one of the really, really formative teachers of his life. The next one, it sounds like wasn't as good of a teacher, but Alexander just liked him, is Lysimachus. Lysimachus will show up in some stories later in this book. And again, he was somebody that came along when Alexander was a little bit older. And then, of course, the most famous one is Aristotle. And yes, I am talking that Aristotle. If you look at the who's who of ancient philosophy, it goes Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. He is just incredible, but he was Macedonian by birth. And so Philip was able to pull him back to teach his teenage son everything that he could. Early on, it looks like Alexander and Aristotle had a good relationship, and for much of the first part of the campaign, this definitely soured over time, which is a little disappointing because you love the idea of like the greatest general and the greatest thinker ever just being tight, but they really weren't, at least certainly not as Alexander's life moved on, but just incredible teachers.
It does seem like Aristotle taught Alexander how to think, though. I mean, it wasn't just that he was a mighty warrior. He was a strategist. He really thought things through. And while he didn't love sports just to play the game, he did seem to enjoy hunting, but also art and music and song and conversation. And I could see that very much from someone taught in that way, from an Aristotelian teacher.
Yeah, I think so. And certainly he had full exposure to philosophy of many kinds because Aristotle is just incredible, and it is that Aristotle.
One more before you move on. Whenever news arrived of Philip capturing a city or achieving a notable victory, Alexander would appear despondent and say to his friends, "My boys, my father will do everything before us. He will leave no great exploits for you and me to accomplish."
He was worried about it.
He wanted to conquer. And it says he didn't really care about pleasure or wealth particularly. He wanted to achieve greatness and conquer everything.
And his ambition really shows up here from an early age. And politics in Macedon and in Greece and in the ancient world were brutal. There are things that Alexander will do that just are horrifying when we think about him today. But that was the world he lived in. And part of being a king's son is that Philip had a lot of other children. And much of what he was doing was setting himself up as the heir of the kingdom, in part because of his ambition, this desire to exceed, but in part because if he wasn't, he'd be killed.
Yeah.
Whoever else took over the kingdom would get rid of him. And so what that meant was, as Philip was having his dalliances with various other wives and women, Philip had to be Alexander had to be very careful and kind of look out for his own. And Olympias was very careful and was looking out for Alexander and herself. And we do see some souring of the relationship between Philip and Alexander as he gets older. There's the classic story where Philip got married to a new wife named Cleopatra. No, not that Cleopatra.
I had to look.
Yeah.
I'm like, no way.
Yeah, no, that Cleopatra is, I think, Cleopatra the Seventh. This one isn't a queen. Well, she was queen of Macedon, I guess, but not the primary queen. Anyway, she was Macedonian, though. And so some of the generals and some of the nobles really loved this idea. And one of them drunk so much drinking in the Macedonian royal court. One of them, while drunk, said, here's to a legitimate issue. And Alexander immediately got insulted by that and said, "What, do you think I'm illegitimate? Here I am." And Philip was drunk out of his mind and actually went to stab Alexander with a spear. But he fell, he tripped because he was blind, stupid, drunk. And Alexander makes some comment of, "Look at this man that would cross over into Asia. He can't even cross the floor because he's so drunk." And so there were things like that kept happening. But throughout all that, there was never really any doubt, I think, that Alexander was going to take power. And that happened sooner than anybody thought it would, because Philip is killed. He is literally murdered out of nowhere. He is stabbed when Alexander is 20 years old, and now Alexander takes the throne.
I heard some about Philip's assassination. I mean, he was killed by an officer of the guard. And there's all these arguments about if he was acting of his own intent or if it was this political plot. But they were celebrating a wedding. Philip was at the peak of his power. He's still young enough to go conquer. He was prepping to, he'd conquered all of Greece, king of Greece, all the smaller tribes of Greece. And he has a new bride, and he's ready to go with this strong army into Asia that hasn't been done before. And he wanted to make peace with Alexander, his heir. Clearly, the kid had ambition. This is the guy he wanted. And so Olympias and Alexander, I think they were at the wedding. But Philip is assassinated right then when he is ready to go. Like, he is prepped to go. So this falls into Alexander's lap. And some tellings said that Alexander was just so sad at how long he'd have to wait to be king because his dad was going to live so much longer.
That's right.
But then he was assassinated. But I don't think Alexander was ever indicated in the plot to kill Philip,
well,
was
there
he?
have been debates on that from the beginning. And even here in Plutarch, there's some references to there are those that thought he was responsible, those who thought Olympias was responsible. And so, yeah, the court rumors have swirled ever since, and you will find people that believe strongly both sides of the issue.
Her I could see.
Totally.
His mother was quite the political plotter, poison, all kinds of fingers in all the pies.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I guess let me pause for a moment here to say it's one of the things that fascinates me about this whole story is how strongly people feel parts of it. I mean, people get worked up defending Alexander or condemning Alexander for things like this that we can't possibly know, but people will do it. But people get worked up about little things. I've been saying Macedon. There were people that will angrily refute and say, no, it's Macedon.
I've heard that too.
And will get really worked up about it and all these arguments. And I guess I just love that this spouts that much passion, that this makes people care about it so much, even 2,300 years later.
Well, Macedon, so you do some Latin, and I think that is an unsettling thing, the V to the W inside of Latin, where instead of Vini Vidi Vici, it would have been Weni, Weedy, Weechi, or is it Wiki?
It would have been Wiki.
Oh, see? Even more twists.
Yeah. So the hard C is the way Latin is spoken. If you see a hard C, or if you see a C, it's not an S sound, it's a C sound. But in English, we have softened that in many places to an S sound. And so you could definitely make the argument that it should be Macedon, and people definitely do. My argument against it is that I've always heard it pronounced Macedon, and we don't say Caesar, we say Caesar. We don't say Cicero, we say Cicero. And so for me, I think it would be pretentious if I threw in the hard C because I don't do it with all these other ones. But this is an example of how people get worked up, and there's thought and argument on both sides of it. All right, well, we have Alexander now king. At 20 years old, you can imagine in the rough and tumble world of these city-states at the time, where Philip has only recently established control, what is going to happen when this untried boy steps into power? Everyone revolts immediately. Alexander wants to take off and conquer Persia, but he can't do it because he can't leave Macedon behind in this state. And from the moment he takes power, we start to see his genius, because this is where he goes on his campaign to those barbaric tribes. And in this rough, brutal land, he basically reconquers the Thessalians, the Illyrians, as you said, up to the Danube River. He pacifies it like a whirlwind, using this incredible army that Philip had made, but also consistently and constantly innovating and leading it. Can we talk about the army just a little bit? The phalanx is what is described as the great army of Philip Alexander, and honestly the Hellenistic empires up until the rise of Rome. The phalanx was infantry. It was men fighting on foot. But Philip had totally redesigned this, and he had given them a spear that we think was 16 to 20 feet long. Again, massive debates
For
about
infantry.
exactly how long. For infantry. It would rest on the shoulders of like 4 men in front of them. And so you would have these spears resting on the shoulders. And so you have this moving box that's a hedgehog that is just steel pointing in front of it. And then the men behind that the sarissa, the spear, can't go the whole way, they would have raised up in the air, which helps to deflect things like arrows, which helps to deflect things like stones. And so what you have is essentially this mobile tank that relies on extreme discipline. The men have to move and work and turn all together. Now, there are similar patterns in like the Greek city-states. So the hoplites, right, is what they do is kind of a phalanx formation. None of them could do what the Macedonians could. They were so well drilled and so good at what they did that they were just untouchable and unstoppable. And so you have the phalanx as the heart of the army. But then associated with that, you have the cavalry. And this is normally what Alexander led, was the cavalry. And he always led from the front. How he didn't die, nobody knows. I mean, he should have many times, but he was always in the front ranks of the cavalry. And they describe this hammer and anvil, where you have this infantry force that would pin an opposing force in place, and then Alexander would come around with this cavalry like a hammer and just smash it against the phalanx. Just incredible innovation. But what you also see as Alexander progresses in his career is how much he modifies this, how much he uses other forms of troops, how much he uses what we call mixed warfare. And he was just literally unbeatable. For his entire military career, he never lost. The closest he came, I think in Afghanistan, one battalion, like a corps that he wasn't personally in command of, was defeated. Outside of that, he just never lost. And it started here in the Balkan states. It started here up to the river Danube. And he was able to pacify them, and they did not rebel for the rest of the time he was alive.
That's amazing. And it can't be an accident. 100% win record is impossible to be an accident.
This is so why Alexander the Great is so fascinating, or one of the many reasons. There's kind of an older way of viewing history, something called the great man theory of history. And so back 200 years ago, this was pretty standard, that the argument was that history progressed because these great men appeared periodically: Alexander, Caesar, Napoleon, George Washington. And it was the entrance of these great men onto the scene that caused some innovation, caused something new, and caused the wheels of history to move forward. Most historians now reject that as just kind of ridiculous. I mean, the forces of history are so much more complicated beyond any single person. But a guy like Alexander makes you wonder. Like, you could see where the great man theory came from when you have a man like this.
I was impressed with not just his strategy in battle, but ahead of battle. Okay, so timing was a big deal. When you approach someone, it says he could sleep so well ahead of this massive battle. And the numbers in this are shocking. Just how outnumbered they were pretty much all the time. Wildly outnumbered. That's fine. No problem. And he'd sleep like a baby.
That's right.
But the messaging he'd sent to disorient his enemies so they didn't know what he was doing. So the size of the fires they'd make to make it seem like they had more numbers, the things they'd leave behind, if they were going to go a different route, they'd leave things behind to make it seem like there was so much more power that they have. Like, excellent marketing in its way. Like, just, I guess it's not marketing because he's not trying to sell it, but it's a representation, a fabrication to just put fear into the hearts of his enemies. I mean, he definitely used fear as a tool as well. And later on, as he developed strength, sometimes he didn't have to fight. They'd just surrender because they knew he was coming.
Very true. And so fast. He could move so fast with these horses. I mean, trying to march men into battle, he could just do things that nobody thought was possible. And you mentioned that later on, when he was strong, he sometimes didn't have to fight. Well, this is early days, and he has not yet proved his strength, and so everybody wants a piece of him. And so he goes up and he settles these tribes north of Macedon, but then he has to turn south and deal with the Greeks because the Greeks are rebelling against him. And this is the great Theban campaign where he goes down and demolishes and totally razes and burns to the ground the great ancient city of Thebes. I mean, he destroys it completely. It's said that he later regrets it, although it's not clear to me whether that's true or not. But again, he could be brutal. I mean, he was a warlord, and he showed what happens when people revolted against him. The good news, I guess, from his point of view, is that it did seem to solve the problem. It cowed the Greeks under his authority so that he could go do this larger campaign against the Persians that he really wanted to do. There is two things that happened, though, after that campaign before the Persian expedition that I think are worth addressing. The first is he actually gets to meet a philosopher. Now, most of us would have considered ourselves beyond fortunate to meet one famous philosopher in history, and he was tutored by Aristotle. But he also had the ability to meet Diogenes the Cynic. Diogenes is a very famous philosopher, and I won't bore you by going into cynicism and the whole thing, but the Cynics were kind of the outcasts in many ways. They rejected sort of normal goods and lived a very austere, simple life for certain philosophical reasons. Well, as Alexander was in, I think, Corinth, he knew that Diogenes was in Corinth, and all these other philosophers were throwing themselves at Alexander, right, fawning upon him as the king. But Diogenes never showed up, and he was wondering, where is Diogenes? And then, this is fantastic, Alexander began walking through the streets, and he sees Diogenes lying out in the sun in this just like ghetto. I mean, just sort of hanging out. And he's not moving, he's not responding. Alexander walks up to him, and the guy kind of opens an eye, and Alexander says, I'm Alexander the king. Can I do anything for you? And Diogenes says, actually, yes, young man, you can stand out of the sun. He was blocking the sun. And Alexander moved aside and thought this was awesome and was quoted as saying afterwards, were I not Alexander, I would choose to be Diogenes.
He seemed to like bold people. I mean, there's stories of even people taken prisoner who act boldly and with pride in their culture and their heritage, and he ransoms them. He gives them gifts. He forgives them. So it's a touchy thing to do because sometimes it went the other way, but not infrequently he would sanction such bold actions like, hey, get out of my sun, little kid.
And this is part of what fascinates me, and I think what has fascinated history with Alexander, is that he's this strange dichotomy. I mean, he is this brutal, unbelievable warlord. The only person I can even remotely compare to him in that sense is Genghis Khan. I mean, this guy that could dominate and that was willing to inflict suffering and pain beyond measure. I mean, that's a hard thing to come to terms with. But at the same time, there's these little quips that get thrown in, these little biography sketches of who he was and things he was thought to have said and done that just make him endlessly fascinating. Yeah. And kind of on both sides with virtue and in terms of just brutality.
That's true. Yeah, I like this one. So this is when he's suddenly king. Philip just died and all his people under him, it says they keenly felt this dangerous crossroads and that they want Alexander to tread cautiously in Greek affairs. He says no. It says Alexander saw things differently. He believed the best course was to ensure safety through boldness, taking decisive actions. He feared that any sign of weakness would invite attacks from his enemies. And I think that says a lot about who Alexander was, like kind of the motivation, because man, he just destroys tribe after tribe, culture after culture, and moves through just countless miles of terrain and conquers all the people. But why? I mean, it doesn't seem like just a bloodthirsty guy. He didn't really want stuff. Like they've described the wealth of the Persians that they'd happen across as he takes their cities. It's just ridiculously extravagant. At first, he doesn't even care about it, and he gives it away very generously, seemingly. But This idea that if you show any sign of weakness, any kind of retreat, you will be destroyed.
Mm-hmm. But you make a really good point about the motivation of Alexander, and I don't know what it is. Books have been written on this and endless debates. What you point out there, this idea of showing weakness, yeah, that's definitely a thing. The other thing that often gets portrayed is a Greek word called arete. Arete is the way it's usually transliterated, and it gets translated in multiple ways. Usually virtue or excellence are the ways it gets translated. And the idea is that everything, whether it's a person or a chair or a table or a rug, has a certain virtue, an excellence, a way of it being the best it can be in that role. And so there was some concept that this is what Alexander was chasing, his excellence, his arete, his virtue, that as a king and a general, his greatness was to continue expanding and conquering. There's also a concept, I think the word is pothos, that gets attributed to him, which is often translated yearning or desire. He had this drive to do this. And it's one of the things that's always struck me about these famous men through histories is just how self-confident they are. Just their willingness to put themselves out there and I am going to do this. There are times I think that's laudable and times I think it's absurd, but it's impressive, whatever else it is. And Alexander had that.
It sure worked for Alexander. And to me, what's shocking is that he has all these, what are they called inside of Greece? Nation states, tribes? Polises that he's only just recently conquered. And yet he goes into Asia to battle the Persian Empire, massive. And he's not in Greece at all. What kind of structure do you leave behind to govern in your absence? What kind of presence do you have to have that those polises that you've just recently demolished have enough fear of you coming back not to just take over again?
Well, what he did to Thebes was impressive. That's part of it. What his father had done was impressive. But the other thing to know is that his father had incredible generals. Alexander has incredible generals, but the old guard, the ones under Philip, were amazing. And so I think it's Antipater Monophthalmos was the one that got left behind to run Macedonia when Alexander left. And he was incredible in his own right. He didn't get along with Olympias. The two of them, a lot of the letters Alexander wrote back was trying to negotiate between the two of them. But
that's fair.
But yeah, his support staff was really incredible.
Man, I think that would be such a difficult job.
Oh, yeah.
Just to fill in the void, the power vacuum that has been made, taking out the government systems, and then he goes off to Persia.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Well, and what a void. I mean, Philip and Alexander, because these are not normal men. And so to step into that role, it's not in Plutarch, but there's a story that after Alexander's death, that they just set up his armor at the table and all his generals would sit around it because none of them could fill the seat of the king. They all thought they could, but they just couldn't because they weren't Alexander. And yeah, definitely a big hole to leave. There's one thing he does, though, before he goes to his Persian expedition. Because remember, religion is really important to Alexander and to all the people here. And so oracles are important, and there is no more important oracle than the oracle at Delphi. This was the great oracle of Apollo. The thing about this oracle, though, is that it wasn't always open. It was open just like a few days out of the year, and there was a line to get there, and there was an order of precedence about when it was open, about who got to speak to the Pythioness, the oracle, the woman in charge of this. Alexander shows up, and they are closed. The oracle is closed, but Alexander is not going to let that stop him. So he literally grabs her from her home by the hair and starts dragging her to the oracle seat to get his oracle before this. That's a bold move. I don't know that I would want to make the oracle mad, before I was about to do this expedition, but this is Alexander. And it said that as he was dragging her up the road, she says, "My son, you are invincible," meaning that she can't resist him. At which point he let her go and said, "I have my oracle."
That's all he wanted.
That's a bold move right there. But that's how Alexander played it.
Oh, man. He also gave many gifts before he left. Like, he spent all his wealth, in essence. And one of his generals under him asked, "What have you kept for yourself?" And Alexander says, "My hopes." This is a bold man.
So that general was Perdiccas, who is one of the great generals under Alexander. And his response was, "Your soldiers will share those with you." Which is a pretty good retort as well. And away they go on this journey. And again, you can't trust numbers in ancient history, but they're written, and so let's talk about them. The army that Alexander set out with to conquer the world, Plutarch gives a range. He says the people that listed at the smallest have somewhere around 30,000 foot and about 4,000 horsemen. The largest estimates were somewhere around 43,000 foot and 3,000 horse. Against the Persians, this is nothing. This is tiny. But it gets even crazier than that. He says that when they cross the Hellespont, right, this body of water that separates the east and the west, they said that Alexander only had 37 days worth of provisions to feed his army. And the only money he had, estimated around, one guy said they thought he had 70 talents. Now remember, Philip was going to spend 13 talents on a horse. So 70 talents for this entire expedition is nothing. And some of the other sources say he was actually in debt over 200 talents. And so he started with an incredible army that was tiny and like no resources to back him up, just his own faith in himself and his own skill as he crossed the water.
So you mentioned the Hellespont. I think I said it earlier. I had to look it up. Do you know what it is today? What's it called? It's the Dardanelles.
I was going to say it's the Dardanelles. Yeah.
I mean, such a pivotal point in both world wars, I believe. I thought that was really interesting how I didn't realize that was the name change, Hellespont to the Dardanelles, and that it's such a pivotal area in terms of crossing over to different regions.
It is on the European side where Istanbul is located, formerly Constantinople.
Names change.
The other thing that is on the Asian side of the Hellespont is Troy. Alexander loved Homer. It was said he slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow. And not just any copy, but a copy that was annotated by Aristotle.
That's so cool.
Isn't that cool?
Oh, man.
And so it doesn't matter how weak he is in money and provisions. If he's near Troy, he is going to do the Troy thing. And so he goes full tourist mode in Troy. At the time, they said you could see the sepulcher of Achilles, the grave of Patroclus, all these great names from the Iliad. You could buy Achilles' armor. You know, they had a version of it that you could buy. So again, full Persian mode or full tourist mode. But he did all the things. He made sacrifices. He ran naked around these tombs according to customs and laid garlands on them. There's one of his best friends we haven't mentioned yet. It's a man named Hephaestion. And Alexander and Hephaestion were best friends. And in the Iliad, Achilles and a man named Patroclus are best friends. And so it was said Alexander laid the wreath on the grave of Achilles and Hephaestion laid the wreath on the grave of Patroclus.
I like that somebody offers him to see Paris's harp. He's like, no, don't care. I want to see the lyre that Achilles played.
That's right. I'm sure they found it.
They probably did.
Here it is. He also made sacrifices and did things to propitiate the ghost of Priam. So Priam was the king of Troy, And as a descendant of Achilles, that's kind of he's sort of a bad guy against the Trojans. And so he wanted to make peace with the shades of the Trojans and with the king. And so these were all religious actions he did before starting the full campaign. And Alexander was always careful to play the religious game. He was always out there to fulfill and do and keep whatever oracles, prophecies, stories. I mean, he was looking to fulfill it all. And so with this done, he could now begin what he was really trying to do, which is go after the Persians. I think the best way to think about the Persian campaign is through the set point battles. There's a handful of major conflicts and battles, and then there's things that kind of happen in between. And so the very first battle is the Battle of the Granicus River.
It says that Alexander has to fight just to cross the water into Asia. It's already defended.
When Alexander stepped over, right, and everyone know, hey, there's this guy with an army, there was a lot of debate about what they should do to help prevent Alexander from conquering. And a number of people said, let's torch it all, scorched earth. Let's burn our fields, burn our crops, burn our cities. He's only got a month worth of provisions. Let's refuse him battle, and he's just going to fade away. That did not go over well. Because again, small army, upstart, and the local satrap, there was no way he was going to just burn everything around him. He's got his own army. And so he is going to engage in this, and he is going to wipe out Alexander to start with. And so he even gets to choose his own ground. So he brings up his forces on the far side of the Granicus River, and then you have Alexander and his men on the other side of it. There's an ongoing motif in the Alexander story where the old men, the counselors, will make recommendations to Alexander, and he'll say no, and then do something daring and ridiculous that works every time. Parmenio is the most famous general of Philip. So he's one of the old guard. And he was actually the one that was in Asia before Alexander crossed. He had actually secured the beachhead when Alexander had come over. And it's Parmenio that gives this advice of, it's late in the day, the river's going to be hard to cross, let's wait. But Alexander is not willing to wait, and he takes his cavalry, and at the front of them, he goes across before anybody, and the battle is enjoined, and then the phalanx rushes to cross the river to try and catch up with Alexander. In many ways, this is one of the most dangerous battles Alexander ever fought, because he was exposed. He didn't even bother to hide himself on the battlefield. He was leading from the front, and he took blow after blow and was a target for every spear and every arrow. In this battle, it talks about how axe strokes came across his helmet that only just barely held. He lost the plumes off his helmet, and he was about to die when somebody took an axe to the back of his head. But then one of his other friends, somebody named Cletus the Black, and when they say the Black in here, they're talking about hair color. Cletus the Black killed the other guy before he could kill Alexander, and so it was a very close call. But once his troops were over and once basically the battle enjoined, it ended up being a rout. And so the satrap's forces, this army of Persia, was dispersed and destroyed, and Alexander was the victor.
You mentioned that you can't believe the numbers, and I don't. Mine says the Persians reportedly lost 20,000 infantry and 2,500 cavalry in the battle. Alexander's army suffered a total loss of 34 men.
9 of them foot soldiers.
I don't believe it.
I don't believe it either. But it does give a sense of the relative rout that this was. And it's really, in many ways, the first of his great set-piece battles against the Persians, where he does what should not have been possible, and he ends up winning and drives them away. Well, after this, he wasn't important enough for Darius to even approach at that first battle. The great king was not involved with this. It was his subordinates that were to deal with this. But everyone heard about this, and so the great king starts mustering his army. But in the meantime, Alexander starts accepting surrender from these different villages and cities because he has just won this great battle, and so he doesn't have to fight. And he goes around and he does things, and this is where the great story of the Gordian knot comes into play. Have you heard of the Gordian knot?
I have, because we just did a short on knots, and it came up. It's like Alexander the Great.
So what is the Gordian knot?
It reminded me of the Excalibur story with King Arthur, but he doesn't solve it in the same way.
No.
Mine says that it's the capital of the legendary King Midas. So same place as King Midas, the one who could turn things to gold. That's amazing. But in essence, there's a wagon tied up with this elaborate knot, and whoever can undo it is destined to be king. Alexander gets frustrated and cuts the thing, according to some.
Plutarch tells two versions of the story in here. The one story is that, yes, he takes out his sword because this knot is tied around this ox cart, but the ends of the knot are buried within the knot itself, and it had been out in the wind and the rain and the elements, and so you couldn't even pick the individual strands out. But again, what were the words of the prophecy? That somebody had to loose this knot, and then he would be basically king of the world. Well, there's a play on words here, as I understand it. The Greek word for loose is luo. That also can mean cut, divide, dissolve. And so when he takes out his sword and slashes through it, he can say, I have loosed the knot, because it's the same word for even cutting. And so this has always been, ever since, referred to as a way of basically finding a simple answer to a complex problem. The other story Plutarch tells is that he didn't cut the knot, that there was a pin in the ox cart. And by removing the pin, the knot would come through freely. And so he was able to loose it by, again, it's sort of cheating, but nothing in the thing said you can't remove the pin. And so, however it happened, the knot was no longer in one piece, and Alexander was thought to have fulfilled this prophecy.
Well, he was taught by Aristotle. He thought it through.
The next thing that happens, though, is that Alexander gets sick. Darius actually wonders, is he going to come fight me? Because there's a bit of a delay right here, because Alexander gets very sick. And it's actually striking how often he is sick and how sick his men are. They are traveling through all sorts of climates, cultures, different people groups, exposed to all sorts of things. The water wasn't always great. The food wasn't always great. And so he was sick. The problem is when you're the king and you're sick, especially if you have a bit of a reputation for violence, doesn't really make doctors want to come and take care of you. Because if you screw up and the person dies, you are going to die in a horrible, miserable way. And so he was horribly sick, but no doctors wanted to come and take care of him. Well, enter Philip. The name Philip shows up again. Philip is a doctor, and he says, no, I have to do it. I'm a doctor. I'm going to take care of him. And so he walks in. But this is Macedonian politics. And everybody is kind of sniping on everyone else. And it says that Alexander received a letter from Parmenio, that general, that says, beware of Philip. Philip is going to poison you. He's going to kill you. It says that Alexander put the letter under his pillow. There's a lot under his pillow. We know the Iliad. We know this letter. And he always keeps a dagger there. So those are the things we know under his pillow. Anyway, he doesn't tell anybody about it. Nobody about it, but he keeps the letter. Philip prepares his brew, his physic, his medicine, and he brings it into Alexander and says, drink this. And I love this scene. And it's one of the things that fascinates me about Alexander. It says that Alexander smiled, looked at the doctor trustingly, handed him the letter, grabbed the cup, and tossed it back in one motion without hesitation. And Plutarch describes just the scene, the contrast, where you have Alexander exuding confidence and faith and smiling, and you have this doctor reading a letter from the senior general condemning him to death. And he's just, no, I'm here to help you. And it just speaks to the trust Alexander had in his subordinates. What an incredible scene. And I mean, you can only imagine that Philip was Alexander's man for life after that. There is nothing he wouldn't do for him after that. And there's story after story like that where Alexander does these things. But just imagining that scene with the terror of the physician and the confidence of Alexander, he pulls through and he can continue the campaign.
He gets better. It's okay. Good for Philip. Oh, man.
Well, this takes us then to the next great battle, and this is the first encounter with Darius. This is not the Darius from the Bible. This is the last Darius king of the Persian Empire. By all accounts, he was a pretty good king. He was actually fairly effective, a good administrator. People tended to like him. He just wasn't the battlefield genius that Alexander was. But to be fair, no one in history is.
Plutarch does mention that he's super handsome.
That's right. Very
Darius.
tall.
Very tall, very good looking.
And the organization of Persia is just unbelievable. It was incredibly massive, incredibly efficient, so wealthy, and Darius was at the top of this. And at the Battle of the Issus, he shows up with his army in front of him. This is the imperial army. And again, the numbers are absurd, how much Alexander was outnumbered. And this one, Alexander just trounces him. It's like it's not even close. He goes directly for him, and Darius flees. He leaves the field, and Alexander has conquered. The Persian army leaves. There are some Greek mercenaries within the Persian army. Alexander slaughters them to a man or puts them into slavery so that no other mercenaries would ever fight against him from the Greeks. This was what they could expect. He shows a great deal of lenience, though, to many of the others.
So Darius gets advice from, I think it's a general, that says, stay out on the open plains. You don't want to be in the hilly country with Alexander. But Darius was worried that Alexander would escape. And so they end up passing each other in the night. Their armies somehow take two different routes and pass one another in the dark. Mm-hmm. But then they're backtracking. They're going back to lands that are familiar to them. But yeah, Darius loses big time with way more people. But yes, Alexander on the winning side, he seems to be a generous winner, even to the point that he captures the king's mother, wife, and 2 daughters, among others, and he treats them royally. He protects them. They are sheltered. At some point in mine, it says that they live unseen and unmolested, more as though they were in some sacred retreat of holy virgins than in a camp. And these are beautiful women during a time of terrible warfare. And he shelters them. It's amazing, really.
Again, it's what's so interesting about Alexander, because it's the extreme violence and brutality of the warlord. But then you have this incredibly chivalrous attitude. It's unbelievable. Alexander is amazing. He is so interesting, and you can spend forever just kind of trying to think about what was going on in his head.
You said earlier that he came with this tiny army in comparison, and so ill prepared. They didn't have the resources and the stuff with them. But multiple times here, I think it's that attitude of a winner, where here he conquers Darius in this battle, and so he takes over the royal pavilion of the king of Persia, and it's so luxurious and extravagant. And Alexander says, "Let me wash off the battle sweat in Darius's bath." And one of them says, "No, nay, in Alexander's bath, for the possessions of the defeated belong to the victor." He didn't leave home with nothing. He left home looking to acquire.
Yeah.
He was going to go get stuff, and Persia had stuff.
All the stuff.
All the stuff.
Yeah, and that's what's so fascinating about this part of the campaign is now Alexander has stuff. He now has wealth. He can pay and enrich his troops. He's got provisions, and he's got time, because he knows Darius is going to raise another army, but he's not going to be able to do it right away. He's got to go raise another army. And so Alexander has time to establish things like supply lines to make sure that he's safe and to prepare for this next conflict with Darius. You never get a sense that Alexander has any doubt that he can handle anything Darius throws at him. And, well, that bears itself out. But what that leads to is a really interesting, almost intermission here in the Persian campaign. Because remember, Persia was huge and included some things like Egypt. And Persia also was a conquesting power. And so Egypt had not always been Persian and wasn't necessarily happy to be Persian. But we're not to Egypt yet. First, he's got to go down the coast towards Egypt. And this is one of the most impressive things Alexander did. And this is the siege of a city called Tyre, Tyre. This is an island fortress. It is out in the water in the Mediterranean. And he didn't really have a navy, nothing so to speak out. And he took several months to stop and destroy this city. He turned this island into an isthmus, basically. He grew this mole of earth out to it. His engineering feats were phenomenal. He had an incredible corps of engineers, and his ability to do siege warfare was amazing because nobody thought he could take Tyre. Well, he did. Anytime you tell Alexander you can't do it, you can pretty much guess the next thing Plutarch is going to describe is how he did it. And that definitely is the case here. So he conquered Tyre, he conquered Gaza. There is one real fun part, though, about the siege of Tyre that I think, again, speaks to Alexander. It took a while. It was several months, I think, that they were around that island. And during that time, Alexander would go out and conquer other things because it's what he does, these other tribes and these other villages. And Plutarch describes an excursion to Mount Antiabanus. And what's funny about this is that one of Alexander's old teachers decided he wanted to go along. This was Lysimachus, not his best teacher, but somebody that Alexander loved, and he's old at this point. But he says, no, I'll go up the mountain with you. And so Alexander is actually falling behind his men because Lysimachus can't go faster. And night comes, and he's really isolated and alone with only a few of his men around him. And he's looking out around him, and he sees the fires of the enemy. They're spread out into these different campfires, these different tents. And it says that Alexander jumps into one of these fires. He grabs a stick, kills the men with his dagger, takes the burning flame back, lights up a big fire, scares everybody else into thinking there's a lot more Macedonians, and he almost single-handedly conquers this tribe through this daring night attack because he's not going to leave his elderly teacher behind. I thought that was amazing. I had never heard that story before. I'd never caught it in my previous reads of this. Just, it's things like that that make you just think, wow. Because Alexander, not only an incredible statesman, not only an incredible general, but like hand-to-hand combat with a dagger in the middle of the night. I mean, just incredible what he could do.
Well, and the loyalty to his friend, to his old friend. It says he refused to leave him behind. And so I don't think this was his first choice to do it, but he wasn't going to leave him. And so amazing loyalty and leadership along the way as well. Not a perfect man. Clearly made mistakes and was immensely brutal along the way. But things like that, wow, he was human and he cared for people as well. Both.
There's one other thing that happens here at the same time with one of his other teachers. So we spoke about Leonidas, right? The first of his teachers that was really stern, really very aggressive with him. And one of the things was that as a young boy, Alexander had been chastised for offering too many spices to the gods. So he had grabbed fistfuls of incense that he was going to throw on the fire to the gods. And Leonidas says, nope, you can't afford that. Don't do that. Give less until you have conquered those lands where these come from. Alexander at this point sent him pounds of myrrh and frankincense and spices so that his former tutor would no longer be stingy with his offerings to the gods.
He's always sending gifts back home to his mom, to his family, to his friends, and yes, his old teacher. And I think it's after he conquers Tyre. It's Tyre, not Tyre, right?
I've heard it pronounced both, and as we've clearly established, I don't know how to pronounce anything, so I would believe either one.
Well, once he conquers it, there's all these treasures inside, and he finds a chest, a particularly special chest. It says it might be the most valuable of all the treasures taken from Darius, and this becomes the casket in which he carries his copy of the Iliad.
He loves it. Loves it.
No longer under his pillow.
Well, he has now secured the coastline, and so now is the progression into Egypt. And Alexander in Egypt is fascinating. He was appointed pharaoh. It is not clear all the details or anything behind it.
Was he?
Yes. They basically implied his mother was always being accused of infidelities, but always with kings or gods. And so they they said, yeah, actually, I think our last pharaoh went up to Macedon about the right time. You're clearly the descendant of our pharaoh. They didn't like the Persians, and so this was an opportunity, and so they welcomed him. This was rare in Alexander's campaign. Usually he had to fight his way through, but he stepped in here and was received as a liberator. And I think his men had a wonderful time in Egypt. They had a great time there. He took on the role of pharaoh. And he also decided he was going to make cities, which he did all over the place. And this one, so important, Alexandria. Alexandria, which he built on the mouth of the Nile. And this is where the great lighthouse, the Pharos, was built, one of the wonders of the ancient world, much after Alexander's time. But this city that he built ended up becoming the capital of Egypt until the end of the Pharaonic age, with the death of that Cleopatra at the end. And so Alexandria was a modern city. It was well laid out and just incredible. And it all started here with Alexander. The other really cool thing about his trip to Egypt was that he went to the Oracle of Amun at Siwa Oasis.
Apparently it was a really hard trip too.
Yeah.
But he did it.
Yeah. There have been entire armies lost in the desert trying to get to Siwa Oasis. Even at Roman times, I think a legion was lost. Definitely the Persians lost massive forces trying to get to Siwa Oasis. But that oasis was one of the most important temples of the ancient world and one of the most important oracles. It rivaled the Temple of Delphi. When the King Croesus was asking whether he should go fight against the Persians many hundred years earlier, it was to the oracles of Delphi, Dodona, and Amun that he sent messengers. So an incredibly important place. But let me tell you, it is in the middle of nowhere. So I'm delighted by this because I had the great blessing of getting to spend some time in Egypt. I did a semester in Cairo when I was in college. And one of the weekends of my life that I will never forget, me and a few friends got on the bus to make our way to Siwa Oasis, which is still there. It is in the middle of the desert. There is nothing around it. So if you're in Egypt, the Nile runs north and south and is kind of on the eastern side of the nation. And everything is sort of green right around the Nile. Well, we took a bus from Alexandria and it was hours to get to Siwa Oasis. And it was just sand dunes on either side. There was nothing there. The weird part was every so often the bus would stop and somebody would get out and start walking into the sand dunes. No idea what was there because I couldn't see anything in the distance, but I hope they're okay. But Siwa Oasis is incredible because all of a sudden you go from these sweeping dunes of sand to palm trees and water. I mean, there's now a distilled water plant there. I mean, it's just incredible, but it's still small and still tiny, but the ruins are there. And so I've gotten to walk through the ruins, and the fact that he marched there, just unbelievable that he made it at all.
I thought his questions were interesting when he got there. So he is greeted like he's the son of a god. He asks if his father's murderers escaped. And that doesn't make any sense if his father is a god. He's like, okay, Philip. Did any of Philip's murderers escape? But he is reassured that Philip's murderers were all found and that Alexander is fated to conquer all mankind. I mean, he got good news for this trip.
He had a wonderful time in Egypt. I love the way the priest greets him because Plutarch kind of makes fun of this a little bit. Plutarch kind of makes fun of this a little bit, and there's a bit of a Greek pun or mistake, but kind of like the oracle at Delphi, Alexander just goes with it. The Greek words that were spoken by the priest, I believe, were supposed to be ho paideon, which is, oh, my son, right? My son. But apparently this guy didn't know Greek very well, and so he said, oh, paideos, which is, oh, son of the god. And again, Alexander ran with it.
Plutarch talks about this kind of throughout a little bit, that Alexander didn't necessarily believe that he was a son of a god, although he'd use it. He would frequently use it to make a good impression. It depended on who he was talking to. He could play the court game too. And so whether or not he believed it seemed to change depending on who he was speaking to. But he really liked being called son of the god.
Yeah. Well, the Egypt time, I'm sure, went all too quickly for...
Wait, one more, because I just thought this was great. It says when he's founding Alexandria that he remarked that Homer, besides his other admirable qualities, was also a splendid architect. Explain this one to me. How is Homer part of the decision of the location of the city?
Where this is written in Plutarch comes right after that story of the box and how he had put the copy of the Iliad in it. And then it expresses that he had a dream where an old man with gray hair uttered this line of poetry which spoke about the Pharos island off the top of it. And so that man in the dream, he believed to be Homer, guiding him to where Alexandria was going to be built.
Very cool. All right.
Meanwhile, in Persia, the King of Kings is busy rounding up another army and stewing over the fact that his harem has been taken away. His mother, his wife, his daughters are under the power of Alexander. And so Darius sends Alexander a message and he offers him something. He tells him, I will give you, I can't remember how much, I think 1,000 talents.
Mine says 10,000 talents.
10,000 talents.
It's a lot of warships.
A lot of warships, but a drop in the bucket for what the king could afford. He would give him his daughter as wife, and he would grant him all the land west of the Euphrates River, if only he would make peace with the king. And this is, again, one of those wonderful scenarios where you have the older counselors speaking to Alexander. And this is Parmenio again. Poor Parmenio. Everything we know about him is that he was a phenomenal general and an incredible asset to Alexander, but he always gets used as the foil here against Alexander. And Parmenio's words were, if I were Alexander, I would take this offer. To which Alexander responds, were I Parmenio, so would I. And then turns it down.
It's right after this, though, that the wife of Darius, it says she died in childbirth. So she hadn't been touched. So presumably this is Darius's child, but she dies. It says Alexander is deeply saddened because he misses an opportunity to display his magnanimity.
And the way Plutarch tells the story, one of the eunuchs of the harem actually escapes, hops on a horse and is able to flee back to Darius and tells Darius about the death of his wife. And Darius is heartbroken because it means she wasn't given due funeral honors, right? She didn't get to live in this way. But the eunuch says, no, you don't get it. She was buried in full honor. The only thing lacking was your smiling face.
Well, Darius doesn't like that because he assumes if she was buried with honor, something happened between her and Alexander. And this same servant begs him not to rob himself of this comfort, that his wife was treated well. And here Darius says something to the effect of he hopes he can repay Alexander someday. He doesn't want to lose to Alexander, but he can repay some of the kindness shown to his wife.
Mm-hmm. And if I'm reading my version right, he basically says that if he were to die, right, if he were to fall, he doesn't want any king of Persia now except Alexander. Now, again, do I really think he said that? Not so much, but it's a good story from Plutarch.
So, again with the numbers, Darius confronts Alexander with an army of 1 million men.
So here we have the Battle of Gaugamela. This is it. This is the final set-piece battle between Alexander and Darius. Again, we had the Granicus, we had the Issus, and now we have Gaugamela. And again, we have Parmenio, this kind of older foil, saying, that's a lot of people in that army. Maybe we should fight at night. If we fight at night, maybe then it won't be as scary. Why don't we fight at night? And Alexander classically says, I will not steal a victory. And he is determined to fight during the day. The armies have been lined up for a few days here. You see the difference in generalship between the two commanders. You have Darius, who keeps his men in full armor, basically at attention up through the night, watching and seeing what's going to go on. And then you have Alexander letting his men eat, setting them up appropriately. And Alexander does a bit of showmanship here, where he sleeps heavily through the night. And it said that he oversleeps. And Parmenio has to call him like 2 or 3 times in the morning, like, hey, we got a battle. He's like, oh, is that today? Kind of deal. I mean, he is as cool and calm as it is possible to be. But again, he is Alexander and he is amazing. And the battle starts. And Alexander goes for the throat, which is straight at Darius. Darius is in the middle in his golden chariot with everything around him. And quickly he realizes he's about to die and again flees the field. And Alexander sets off in pursuit. But unfortunately, Alexander can't actually go after him because right about here, poor Parmenio. Parmenio has been commanding the left, and he gets a message from Parmenio that the left is falling. And so Alexander comes back with his men to support Parmenio and utterly rout this massive force.
1,000,000 men. That's insane to me. Great details about this battle, though, because Parmenio at some point sends a message that their stuff is being overwhelmed, all the baggage, all the supplies behind. And Alexander is unconcerned. He's never concerned about the stuff. He's like, don't you know the victors get the stuff? Fight on. And as Alexander's organizing the troops, it says he rode a different horse because Bucephalus, the horse, back from when he was a boy, is still his war charger, his charger in battle. And so he rides a different horse while he's organizing the troops. But in battle, heading towards Darius, he is riding his old friend, Bucephalus.
Have you ever watched the relatively new show Father Brown on BBC?
A little bit.
His bicycle, he named Bucephalus.
I didn't know. That's excellent.
It's great.
Did Chesterton name the bike Bucephalus?
I don't remember if that's from the books, but it's definitely in the TV series.
Okay. Chesterton wrote the Father Brown series originally. So.
Darius has now fled the field twice against Alexander. He has lost 2 full Persian armies. Darius is now fleeing for his life. Darius is never going to be able to gather one of these armies against Alexander again. Alexander is now king of Persia by conquest and by right.
Mine says the outcome of this battle was the utter collapse of the Persian Empire. I mean, what a statement. The Persians, this massive empire. But from there, Alexander marches on, because that's what he does, into Babylonia. What do you make of this segment, this aside about Naphtha?
Part of what Plutarch is doing is telling wild stories about crazy things in other parts of the world.
This is a crazy thing in another part of the world.
It's basically a burning river or this lake, this chemical. So naphtha is, we think, involved with things like Greek fire, with things that burn easily, and it's naturally occurring and it's over there. It's kind of like parts of the world where there's natural gas and there's just this flame that is always there. That's basically what's going on here. And it's such a wild thing that I think Plutarch felt he had to comment on it. It doesn't go well for at least one of his soldiers, though.
Yeah, it's like a servant boy is like, oh, put it on me. Let's see if it burns. And then it burns. Seems stupid, but he turned out okay. It turned out okay. They brought water. I don't know. They were showing Alexander this novelty, I guess. So maybe it was part of playing tourist. But I love this from Plutarch that says, these tangents, as long as they are not overly extended, we hope will not be burdensome to our readers.
And it is one of my goals that I hope readers will pick up Plutarch, because each of these stories is just packed. There's thing after thing after thing after thing. And again, we're skipping a ton of them, but there's these really great little anecdotes and incidents and things that are just so much fun. And Plutarch does a really good job with that. For example, as they're moving through Persia, he describes just almost offhand how Alexander passes this fallen statue of Xerxes. Xerxes, the great king who led the invasion against Greece, and his statue is there, but it's on the ground. And he stops and he looks at it and he thinks, should we lift up this statue of this great king? I mean, he's a king. He's a great king. There's this on the ground. Or do we leave it lie because of what he did to the Greeks? He let it lie. But he thought about it.
He thought about it. I noticed that too.
And this is actually a pretty good intro. The stated reason why Alexander was doing this campaign, we talked earlier about possible reasons why, but the reason he claimed was to revenge the Greeks against the Persians. Because during the Greek and Persian wars, the Persians had burned Athens, including all the temples. And so this was retribution for that. And so he now has that opportunity as he's moving through these Greek capitals. And this takes us into the story of the burning of Bucephalus. The story here is, again, I think probably a fiction of Plutarch. There's a lot of discussion about why Alexander burned this royal palace. Well, according to Plutarch, it was a drunken decision as he was spurred onto it by a prostitute named Thais. Thais thought it would be great to burn this palace, and so he grabs a torch and does it. And this incredible, incredible place goes up in flames.
He says he regrets it later.
Yeah. But the other argument was that he kind of had to do it because this was the revenge for the burning of Athens. And so at this point, in many ways, the initial goal of his whole invasion is over. He's done. He's done it. He's revenged the Greeks upon the Persians. He has soundly defeated Darius. Darius is no longer a threat. He is now king of Persia. The war could be over at this point. And I think some of his men were thinking, hey, maybe the war is over at this point. They've been gone from home for a long time. Alexander does not know how to stop and is not going to stop. And the war is not over at this point.
At this point in my book, there's a lot of examples of gifts, very generous gifts that Alexander gives to all kinds of different people, to servants and soldiers and generals and friends and his mother. And it's funny, his mom is quoted writing a letter that basically says, if you give everybody such luxury, they're going to make friends and they're going to exclude you. She was always looking for that position and protection of what he was doing. But a lot of gifts went to his mother, but there's also plots now. So when you're fighting battles and pushing the line and everybody's clear on the goal, I think it's actually a lot simpler in a way. Here's where these plots against Alexander start cropping up. And it gets more political and he gets more jaded. He starts becoming more jaded. And in part for good reason, and in part not. It's his judgment on it is cloudy.
I think you are absolutely correct on that. Can I tell my two favorite stories, though, of Alexander giving gifts?
Do it.
My favorite one, I think, is he walks along and he sees this common soldier who is struggling under a load. It's the king's treasure. That's his treasure that this common soldier is carrying. And he's carrying it because his donkey went lame. So the donkey is walking next to him, hobbling along, but this mass of golden treasure and armor is being carried by this poor man, and this man is getting exhausted. This is not a noble. This is not a general. This is just one of his foot soldiers. And Alexander goes up to him and says, why are you going so slow? The guy says, well, I'm tired. I'm carrying all this. I think I might give way here. And Alexander says, no, don't give way. Be strong. Carry it the whole way directly to your tent. It's all yours. I mean, that's a noble act. Mm-hmm. He just gave this to this poor guy who was struggling along, acting like a donkey. That's awesome. The other one is another one who I think is a noble, who they're talking about golden cups. And this guy says, it's tradition, right, where I come from, to receive a golden cup from royalty. And Alexander says something to the effect of, yeah, when they give them, those are usually empty, right? Well, yeah, I give you this one full of wine. And he gives his own golden goblet to this man full of the wine he's drinking. That's just beautiful. That's a wonderful gesture.
As he's giving all these gifts, though, especially to his friends, they are becoming soft. Mm-hmm. These hard generals, these battle-hardened generals are giving these extreme luxury, extravagance. Think of Persia. All the Persian wealth is now theirs, and he just doles it out like crazy. The one that really got me is the guy who keeps the camels laden with Egyptian dust with him at all time. So at any point they can throw down a wrestling pit, I guess. I mean, they'd carry water from the Nile with them for these great distances, just extreme extravagance. And Alexander sees it and thinks, you guys are becoming soft. Here's a quote. Do you not realize that our conquest will come to an end on the day we start living like those we have conquered? I don't know if he really said that, but it does seem very prophetic to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there is this interesting shift that happens with Alexander here. One, you described him getting more jaded, and definitely true, and we're going to see some stories about that. It's easy to like the younger Alexander. It's much harder to like Alexander for the rest of this biography. But you also see Alexander starting to rule. Up to this point, he has conquered, but now he's got this entire empire that he is the king of, and he has to rule. And you start seeing him do things like starting to wear Persian dress, start adopting Persian manners. And the Macedonians are not okay with some of this. And so you start to get these conflicts between Alexander and sort of his new people and his old people, and jealousies and rivalries and things like that pop up. The generals of Alexander are incredible. But there's two names that I think right now are probably worth us talking about a little bit in the light of what I just said. And that's Hephaestion, who we've already met, and somebody named Craterus. Hephaestion is Alexander's best friend, full stop. They are so close their entire lives. There's a story, I don't think it's in this one, but in one of the other, where it says that somebody after one of the battles walked in and they addressed Hephaestion as the king because he was taller than Alexander and better looking. And everyone else was shocked because, like, you get in trouble for not recognizing the king. But Alexander says, no, 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 no. He too is Alexander. They were so close and such good friends. Hephaestion would adopt the Persian customs like Alexander would. And it says that when Alexander had to do things with the locals, with the Persians, Hephaestion would be his mouthpiece, would be the one that he would send to do that. Meanwhile, you have Craterus. Craterus has risen to the rank of essentially number 2 in the army, and he didn't adopt any of the Persian dress, tactics, customs. He was Macedonian to the core. And so when Alexander needed somebody to communicate with his Macedonian soldiers, he would send Craterus. And he had these kind of 2 chiefs of staff, essentially, to help him work through this diplomacy. They didn't always get along, though, because, again, rivalries. And at one point, they drew on each other to have a duel. Apparently, Alexander berated both of them, and as much as he loved them, threatened to kill them if they ever did anything like that again. And they were very polite to each other from then on.
Lesson learned. Do you have more? Should we follow Darius?
I think we should follow Darius because Darius is still alive. He's a figurehead at this point, but Alexander wants him, and Alexander now gathers an army, although his army is shifting, and there's all sorts of debate on what it looks like now. It still has a Macedonian core, Macedonian officers, but now he has things like Persians under his command. He has these different tribes under his command. These people are coming over to him. It's at this time, I think, he actually selects the 30,000 Persian youths to be trained in Greek warfare, Macedonian warfare, Greek language, Greek ways. I mean, he's got plans. Remember, his whole army to start with, we think, was around 30,000. And so now he has that in just these Persian boys that he's raising up to be kind of a replacement army. Well, away he goes, and it feels like everything Alexander does, the next thing he does is always crazier and always harder. Because now he is going into the north of Iran, what we now know as Afghanistan. And the fact that he goes and conquers there, no one else has been able to do it.
And it says the march is horrible and the soldiers are dying from lack of water. And somewhere along the line, there's these locals who say, you can have our water. It's crazy, actually. They say that they were drinking, or they were pulling up water from this well for their own sons, but don't worry, we can have more children. This is for you. But Alexander doesn't drink it. And so he's still that guy, because he says, if I alone drink, all these soldiers will be discontented. He looks around at all these men suffering on the march with him, the one that he's driving to pursue the old King Darius. and he turns down the water. And so he does still have the ability to lead men and to suffer well with them and give them this common goal.
Yeah.
And so that I really enjoyed that as again, don't know if it really happened. It seems a little far-fetched. We can have more kids. You drink it.
Right.
But still the love that his men would have for him, and this, even when he's asking them to do these impossible things, he too would suffer with them. He too would participate. He was always at the front.
At the front, just unbelievable. And somewhere during this march, the objective changes, because it had been to go find Darius, but there was one of the Persian nobility that had enough of Darius, and they ended up killing him. And this made Alexander furious. And so now the job was to subdue these rebel satraps who had dared murder this king. And what you get is this guerrilla warfare campaign. So in Persia, the Battle of Gaugamela, the Battle of Issus, these are set-piece battles. That's not what you're seeing in Afghanistan. You're seeing these hit-and-run tactics, these things on mountaintops. I mean, there's incredible stories in here where Alexander leading 300 men scaling a sheer cliff face to come down on top of a mountain fortress. I mean, just incredible things, and he's always at the front. This is also where, again, I think the jadedness comes into play, and so there's definitely, well, I don't know if definitely, I don't know, but I suspect there are what we would call war crimes going on here. I mean, the frustration of the Macedonians is high, but he wins. He always wins. And he just keeps going. And it's unbelievable to me what he was able to do in this very, very hostile environment.
I heard a story, and I don't know if that was here or earlier on, but I'm going to say it because I forgot to earlier. There was a hillside. So it could have been here. Very hilly. But the enemy was up above them with these wagons. Have you heard this story?
Mm-hmm.
Was it in Afghanistan? Or
I don't think so. I think this was in his Thracian campaigns in the Balkans.
Just the innovation of it is amazing. So the enemy has these heavy wagons up above him, and they have their phalanx formation down below. And the enemy launches these laden wagons, heavy, down this hill at Alexander and his men. And instead of being crushed and overwhelmed, as pretty much everyone else would be, they formed this ramp with their shields. I mean, the quick thinking and innovation where they, in essence, formed their shields into this ramp that launched the wagons up over their head, that is amazing.
Yeah. And that's an example of the army he had, the discipline of his army. No other army could do that, not at that time, and not that quickly and that swiftly. Just incredible. Well, there's a couple other really important things in the life of Alexander that happen around this time. Now, remember, this is a brutal campaign. It is violent on both sides, and I think they are all drinking heavily to kind of come to terms with it. And so you start to see some interesting things pop up. One, he gets married. It's not his first wife, but this becomes his primary wife, and she's a Sogdiana princess. She's supposed to be beautiful, but there were a lot of questions about sort of his persuasion.
What was the word you just, Sogdiana?
Yeah.
What is that?
That's the area. It's a region. So Sogdian, Sogdiana. And so this is his wife who becomes his primary queen and actually has a baby from him, Alexander, who is delivered after Alexander is dead. But he gets married, which surprises a lot of people. But then this is where some of that kind of jadedness comes into play. And so there's three particular cases that I want to mention. The first is somebody named Philotas. We haven't talked about Philotas yet, but we've talked a lot about his dad, Parmenio. Parmenio was of the old guard of Philip and has been one of Alexander's most loyal and senior generals throughout the campaign. Parmenio is not with Alexander right now. He is off in a different part of the empire, but Parmenio's son Philotas is with him, and he falls out of favor with Alexander. Apparently, he's talkative, and so he makes boastful claims that really it was his dad that has won all these battles and not Alexander. And then really where things get in a lot of trouble for him is when people start coming to him with plots to kill Alexander, and he ignores them. Apparently this happened 3 times, and by the 3rd time, this was brought to Alexander's attention, and Alexander has him put to death. It's hard to like Alexander here towards the end of his rule because he kills Philotas, and you can even see maybe why. But then he actually has Parmenio killed as well, which again, you can kind of understand it. You kill a man's son. What is his loyalty going to be to you at that point? But still, my heart breaks a bit for Parmenio because he's been through a lot and he had done a lot for Alexander.
Yeah.
And so we see kind of things like that happening. The next one is in all the sources described as a really, really heinous event. And this is the death of someone called Cletus the Black. This is another name we've already encountered. In that first battle, the battle of the Granicus, this was the man that saved Alexander's life, that killed the other guy before he could kill Alexander. Well, they're drinking, and they end up fighting. They end up drinking and yelling. All the friends keep trying to pull Cletus out of the room, but Cletus keeps coming back and yelling at the drunk Alexander. So they're both just totally out of their wits. And it's said that Alexander grabs a spear and he ends up stabbing this friend. And this is something that almost breaks him. He regrets this deeply, but it's really an inexcusable act, right? To kill a friend while drunk. And so that one's really hard. And then the last one here I want to talk about is Callisthenes. Callisthenes is a philosopher, and he is the nephew of Aristotle. He was actually brought along as the formal biographer, the historian for this entire campaign. And in the early days, he and Alexander seemed to be close. But this guy is a philosopher, and philosophers are weird. This guy wouldn't engage in the drinking parties and these other things. And he kept talking about annoying things like virtue or like right behavior. And he couldn't compete with the politics going on here. And people kept speaking badly about him. And eventually he ended up being imprisoned, and it said he died in prison.
Mine said he wouldn't kneel to Alexander. He wouldn't pay homage like the others would.
In the Persian sense, right? The prostration sort of thing. And so again, we do see sort of a darkening of Alexander and a jading of Alexander. And I think those three deaths kind of illustrate that fairly well.
Alexander gets some good omens, though. So then he continues on. This one was weird. They find this well of oil, almost like olive oil. It says he considers it one of the clearest signs of divine favor ever bestowed upon him. It's really odd.
It is odd. And we are into odd worlds here because they have already gone beyond what they thought the known world was. I mean, they keep thinking that the rivers they come across are actually the Nile or something. I mean, the geography, they've just got no clue. They are so far off the map. But Alexander keeps going. And this is where we have the final great expedition of Alexander into India. The man made it to India. Just unbelievable. And there's multiple stories of these smaller tribes and things he fights, but the last great set piece battle that Alexander ever engages in, according to our sources, is the Battle of the Hydaspes. And this is just unbelievable. In many ways, it's his finest battle, because the Indian forces under King Porus are able to set up their defense on the far side of this great river with elephants.
I was going to say that. So many elephants. Intimidating.
And King Porus was intimidating in his own right. It describes him as being just huge. It says to watch him on an elephant was like watching a normal person on a horse. I mean, this was a mighty, mighty man. And they are there watching, guarding against the forces of Alexander so that he cannot cross. But this is Alexander, and he's always going to figure it out. And so at night, he is able to take and lead a small group of his men across the river, upriver from the opposing forces, and he's able to get some of his horses across. And so then when the morning comes, Alexander leads this small force against the Indians, but then the Indians, when they turn to fight that off, leave themselves exposed to the phalanx crossing en masse. And somehow this river and elephants is not enough to take out Alexander. And Alexander, once more, he just can't lose. And he again wins this incredible battle against all odds in India.
I love the conversation after. So the Indian king Porus lives, and Alexander asks him how he wished to be treated. And Porus answers, like a king.
Now think about what that means for a moment, though, because he is a king defeated in battle. That means he is going to be tortured, killed, mutilated. And he's saying, do it. Whatever it is, I'm a king. Treat me as a king.
Everything is included in those words, like a king. Alexander loves this. He makes the man a satrap. He gives him lands again and properties after that whole bloody battle. All the effort involved. He finds a man he respects and makes him a leader again.
It's one of those many stories that just kind of make you like Alexander. You can see why men followed him. Alexander is ready to keep going. More to conquer.
There is sad news first.
Oh, yes.
After the battle with Porus, Alexander's horse, Bucephalus, died. There's debate whether it was from wounds in battle or from old age. I mean, it's like the horse was 30, which the math doesn't quite line up, but it doesn't bother me. He loved this horse. He loved his pets. There's mention of a dog as well that he honors, to the point that he names a city to honor his dead horse, his friend and companion through all those battles. It's just wonderful. Bucephalus. Sorry, I had to point that out.
No, I'm glad you did, because I agree. That is great. And so after this city founded for Bucephalus, he's ready to keep going. I mean, this is Alexander. There are other wars to fight. His men are done. They've gone farther than they could ever imagine having gone. They're exhausted. They have won everything in front of them. They do not want to cross the Ganges. They do not want to fight anymore.
The Ganges River.
Ganges.
They're from Macedonia. Just the sheer distance blows my mind.
Oh, it's unbelievable. Alexander pouts.
He goes into his tent and gets pouty. He wants to keep going.
He tries to shame them into going. He tries to bribe them into going, but his men, they will not relent. And finally, Alexander has to accept, grudgingly and pouting the whole time, this conqueror of the world turns and goes back to Babylon.
He goes down this river, and it says he's beating tribes all along the way. It's not like there's no battle going back.
No. He's Alexander, is what he's going to do. And actually, the trip back is pretty horrific. I mean, there's some interesting stuff. There's this whole sequence with the 10 Indian philosophers.
I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, about the way these Indian yogis basically respond to questions and things. Again, good book. Recommend reading it. But you also have basically an ocean passage and a land passage. And so one of his friends, one of his generals, he now makes an admiral. This is Nearchus. And he has Nearchus basically take boats along the Indian Ocean on the way back. Meanwhile, Alexander takes his men, what else? Across a desert. Because why not? He goes across a desert. And actually, of all the things that Alexander engages in, this is probably the most dangerous. It says on the passage of this desert, only a quarter of his army survived. So this desert, this natural feature, does what none of the other armies and empires could do against him. One other thing happens, though, as part of this journey back, and this is a siege of a town of a people called the Malians. Again, Alexander is conquering everywhere, but Alexander is also always leading from the front. And Alexander has been wounded many, many times. But this is the most severe wound that I see documented by Plutarch, because he throws a scaling ladder up against the wall, climbs up to the top, says, "Follow me, men," and like 2 guys are able to stick with him. And then the ladder falls down. Alexander jumps into this walled town, and it's him and like 2 guys against everyone. One of the other guys is killed. One of the other guys is injured, but is able to help him. And Alexander takes an arrow to his rib. He takes a mace blow to his neck that dazes him. I mean, he is almost dead. And meanwhile, his men outside are frantic to come and save their king. They do. They end up taking the town, coming in. But this is just an example of the wear and tear and the physical abuse that his body is taking. And this one in particular seemed to have really, really weakened him.
It's true, but they make it back to Macedonia after this crazy adventure down the river through the desert, and so many men die, and he's wounded, seemingly mortally, but he makes it back. And here there's all these weddings.
All these weddings. And it's interesting, the things that get described here. They pass the tomb of Cyrus, Cyrus the Great, and Alexander is touched by the humility of it, because the inscription in front of the tomb basically says, I was this great king, now I'm dead, leave me alone. Give me this chunk of earth to be dead in. But he doesn't get it because his tomb is spoiled. And that strikes Alexander, at least according to Plutarch. He gets to hear stories from Nearchus, the admiral, and he thinks those are great. The ocean voyage just seemed awesome. And so he starts coming up with plans. He's going to go down, he's going to go around Africa and come up through the Pillars of Hercules and do this massive ocean thing. He starts making plans to conquer Arabia, where all the Arabs are. I mean, he's ready to go. He also, as you said, engages in weddings. So he's got all these Macedonians, and he tries to hook them up with Persians in order to have kind of a people here. And there's all sorts of debate on what his end goal was on this. But yeah, lots and lots of weddings.
It also says that he's very pleased with the young Persian boys that he'd sent back to be raised Greek, to be taught Greek customs and taught the language and how to fight like they do. 3,000 young men that are now grown up or more grown up, and they're amazing. They're strong, they're handsome, they have great skill, they're active. And so he starts replacing some of his worn out Macedonians with these Persians brought in.
They're locals who have been trained in the Greek ways,
but they were
Macedonian ways.
Yeah, they were born Persian, then trained Greek. Mm-hmm. But the Macedonians are sad and feel betrayed that he's using these born Persian men now to protect, as his personal bodyguard. Mm-hmm. So this is getting complicated again.
Yeah, and they get angry at him. They speak against him. And Alexander, again, never one to pacify, says basically, we'll forget you guys. And he stops talking to the Macedonians for a while until they crack and come back begging to him, don't abandon us, don't leave us. And then what happens, something that really does, I think, break Alexander. I mean, there was the death of Cletus the Black that I think hit him hard. There are the wounds he's taken in battle. They're also drinking like fish. I mean, it is hard to overemphasize how much wine was a part of Macedonian royal culture. And so these massive drinking parties. And during this period, his best friend, Hephaestus, gets sick. It says the doctors give him very explicit instructions on what to do, not do, what to eat and not eat. But it says he's a young man and a soldier, and he's not going to listen. And so while the doctors were away, he ate fowl and drank some wine. So he had like a bird, right? And he died. And this crushed Alexander. Alexander did not respond well. As a doctor myself, I don't approve of this. He had his doctor crucified because he couldn't save Hephaestus. It said he planned to spend 10,000 talents on his tomb. And because he had to do something, he went and conquered a whole nother people, which he basically said was a sacrifice, a tribute to Hephaestus. Things are getting dark here
in a massacre.
Big way.
Massacred them. And you mentioned earlier his engineers and how grand and extremely capable they are. Well, here one of them suggests that Mount Athos could be carved into the image of a man. So it could be Alexander, but as this tribute to his friend. I mean, he is hitting grief in a big way, and everybody's feeling it. He cuts off all the horses' manes and tails. This is a command from the king. Mm-hmm. Extensive.
And he becomes increasingly suspicious of the people around him. He becomes increasingly superstitious and concerned with omens. There are more deaths, more problems. And he's not very old right now. He's in his early 30s. And at this point, Plutarch describes it fairly bare bones, says he drinks heavily, he passes into a delirium, and he dies.
At 32.
At 32.
All of that. He became king at 20, conquered so much of the known world, and died at 32 from a fever.
ever since there has been debate about what really killed him, because it seems silly that this titan, right, this unbeatable general and leader could die from something so simple as drinking too much. But in the early days, there was no actual evidence that there was any sort of poisoning or foul play. I mean, since then, that's been thrown around a lot. The concept that he was killed by someone, assassinated by someone. I've heard theories about malaria. I mean, I've heard all sorts of different things, but I don't know. The more of it I read, the more I think with as bright as he burned, right? With as much as he did with his body, with his stress, with the drinking, with everything else. Yeah, I just think he died.
And the grief.
And the grief.
I mean, it's so close after the death of his friend. And just a tragic ending to this, as you say, brightly burning life. Just amazing what he accomplished and how he did it all. And then to come back home, I think once you stop, to be a person like that, just all action, all drive, all the time. And then he stopped. It's sad, though, the drinking, because early on it says he didn't even like wine that much. He liked the conversation. He was a slow drinker. He'd have a cup as he conversed with others. But that was when he was young. That was before he became sad. That was before his body went through so much. So, you know my problem with history, right?
What's that?
Everybody dies at the end.
It's true. None of us get out of this alive.
So you say that you're a student of history. It's my problem with history. But an amazing story. I learned so much. An amazing man.
Amazing man. And again, this is one of our main sources on it. There are other sources and other stories, and then the mythology that has sprung from him is just phenomenal, what has come up over the ages. I think I will always enjoy reading about him, always enjoy learning about him. He is the one character in history that I think deserves the epithet the Great more than any other. I mean, sometimes you hear about other the greats and you kind of go, really? Especially compared against Alexander. Like, you didn't do what Alexander did. But Alexander, I think, certainly deserves the epithet. I think I'll end this with a story from a different source because it's not in Plutarch, and I can't remember which one it's in, but this one has always stood with me because what happens after this is the wars of the Diadokoi. These are the wars of the successors of Alexander. Out of his empire, multiple kingdoms were carved and totally shaped history moving forward. And these men that ruled these kingdoms, none of them could rule the entire empire or realm of Alexander. And I think there's some foreshadowing of that in this story. It is said that when Alexander was dying on his deathbed and really couldn't even speak, he managed to come up with just a couple words. His generals gathered around him and they said, "To whom does the kingdom go? Who gets the empire?" And Alexander's words were, "To the strongest." And with that, we'll turn the page, and we hope you join us for the next chapter.